Everyone assumes Family Guy just throws quick shots at famous people and moves on. A cutaway here, a name drop there, gone in 5 seconds. A federal judge sat down with one of those 5-second jokes and saw something else entirely. In this video, we break down every time Family Guy destroyed a celebrity. The sitcom legend who sued, Carol Burnett, 5 seconds of screen time ended up inside a United States District Court. That is how long the joke lasted, start to finish, before the show moved on to something else entirely and never looked back. The woman on the receiving end did look back, and what she saw was worth hiring lawyers over. The episode was called Peterotica, and it aired on April 23, 2006, during the 4th season. The main story followed Peter Griffin discovering that he could write filthy paperback novels and sell them for money, which begins the way most Peter ideas begin, with a trip somewhere he probably should not be. He and his friends walk into an adult video and bookstore called Pornoslavia, a business the show establishes had formerly been a chicken restaurant. Peter looks around and says he expected the place to be dirtier than it actually is. Quagmire explains that the shop stays clean because Carol Burnett works there part-time as a janitor. The camera then cuts away to show her, an animated woman in a blue bonnet, pushing a mop across the floor of the store, standing beside a rack of adult films, a curtained booth area, and a bin of blow-up dolls. Anyone over a certain age recognized the figure instantly. That was the charwoman. The mop-carrying cleaning lady character Carol Burnett had performed in sketch after sketch across 11 seasons of her own variety program. Underneath the whole image, a slightly changed version of the theme music from her show played in the background. The gag did not stop at the visual. One of the men in the store brought up her famous sign-off, the moment at the end of every episode where she tugged her ear before saying goodnight to the audience. One character explained that the ear tug was her way of saying goodnight to her mother. Another character followed that with a crude question about what she must have tugged to say goodnight to her father. In real life, the ear tug had nothing to do with any of that. Burnett had used it as a small private hello to her grandmother, who had raised her. To understand why this landed the way it did, it helps to know exactly what the Carol Burnett show meant to American television. It ran on CBS from 1967 to 1978, 11 seasons of live sketch comedy, musical numbers, and dance, built with a regular company of performers including Harvey Korman, Vicki Lawrence, and eventually Tim Conway. The show pulled in armfuls of Emmy Awards and turned its cast into household names across the country. Burnett herself had come up through Broadway and variety television before landing in Los Angeles, and by the end of that run, she was one of the most respected comic performers alive. The charwoman was the character most closely tied to her personally, a quiet cleaning lady, alone on a stage, mop in hand, daydreaming about a bigger life. The character opened and closed the program in cartoon form, appeared in countless sketches, and became the closest thing the show had to a mascot. Placing that specific character on the floor of a pornography shop aimed the joke squarely at the single image Burnett had spent decades building, rather than at a name pulled at random from a list of famous people. There was also history between the two sides that most viewers watching at home knew nothing about. According to the lawsuit filed later, Fox had approached Burnett in 2005 asking permission to use the theme song from her show inside an episode of Family Guy. She turned the request down. Her filing claimed that after that refusal, the episode was rewritten specifically to make fun of her, right down to the use of her signature ear tug. From her side, the show had taken a swing at a public figure who had already told them no, which made the whole thing look less like satire and more like retaliation. Nearly a year after the episode aired, in March 2007, Burnett filed suit in United States District Court against 20th Century Fox. The claims covered copyright infringement over the use of the charwoman, along with violation of her right of publicity and misappropriation of her name and likeness. Reported damage figures varied across coverage at the time, with some outlets citing a demand of $2 million and others reporting she sought more than $6 million. Her filing also raised the altered version of her theme music playing under the scene. She wanted the episode changed or she wanted paying, and Fox was not interested in either option. Fox responded publicly with an argument that stung precisely because it was fair. The network pointed out that Carol Burnett had built an entire career on parody. Her show had spent 11 years spoofing movies, celebrities, commercials, and famous scenes, sometimes ruthlessly. A studio statement noted that Family Guy, much like the Carol Burnett show before it, was known for pop culture parody and satirical jabs at famous people. The message underneath was simple enough. She had spent a decade doing to other people roughly what had now been done to her. The case moved fast. In June 2007, less than 3 months after the filing, United States District Judge Dean Pregerson threw the lawsuit out. The ruling leaned on the constitutional protection given to parody, finding that the brief use of the charwoman inside a comedy program was protected expression rather than infringement. The judge noted that celebrities of Burnett's stature are regular targets of parody and crude humor, and that using an existing character in a crude joke takes far less creative talent than inventing a character like the charwoman in the first place. He suggested she might take some comfort in that fact. That last line is the part legal writers kept quoting for years afterward. The court sided with the show while openly telling the show that what it did was the lesser artistic act. Burnett lost the case and still walked away with a federal judge on record saying her original work required more skill than the joke made from it. The dismissal turned the whole episode into something bigger than a squabble between a comedian and a cartoon. The case became a regular reference point in discussions about parody, fair use, and what a network can legally do with a famous character it does not own. Law schools and media writers pulled it out whenever the question came up. A joke that lasted 5 seconds ended up as a small piece of American case law. For Family Guy, nothing changed at all, which was the loudest part of the outcome. The episode stayed exactly as it aired. The scene was never trimmed. No apology followed. The show carried on making the same kind of joke about the same kind of person for years afterward, now with a court ruling behind it. Burnett has spoken about the situation only rarely since, and the show has largely left her alone, though her name did surface again in a 4th season episode where the show argued that certain modern comedians had not earned the standing she had. The legal fight itself was closer than the speed of the dismissal makes it sound. The central question was whether the scene counted as parody in the way the law understands that word. Parody protection generally covers work that comments on the thing it is copying. Burnett's side argued that the scene did not comment on the charwoman at all. Their position was that the target of the joke was Carol Burnett personally, the real woman, and that borrowing her character was simply a convenient way to get at her. If a court accepted that argument, the protection would not apply, because the show would be using someone's creation as a tool rather than saying anything about the creation itself. Fox argued the opposite, that placing a famously innocent character in the least innocent setting imaginable is itself a comment on the character and on the wholesome television era she came from. The court came down on the side of the show, finding the use transformative enough to sit inside the protection. And that ruling is the reason the case still turns up in discussions about how far a comedy program can go with somebody else's property. The rest of that episode is worth a look too, because the Burnett gag is nowhere near the point of it. Peter Rodica follows Peter discovering that he can write cheap adult novels, then watching them sell well enough that his wealthy father-in-law offers to publish them properly. A truck driver listening to one of the audio versions gets so distracted that he crashes, which leads to a lawsuit against Peter over the content he wrote. The episode is a story about a man being sued for something he made up, then a real person sued the show over a scene inside it. The charwoman moment occupies the first minute or so of the story and then disappears. That is how the show handles almost every famous name it uses. The cutaway structure means a celebrity gets a handful of seconds of screen time, no setup, no explanation, and no return. There is no episode of Family Guy about Carol Burnett. There is a doorway she walks through on the way to the actual plot. The irony that Fox leaned on in public was not invented for the courtroom either. The Carol Burnett Show was one of the great parody machines in American television history. Its writers took apart Gone with the Wind in a sketch that became one of the most famous pieces of comedy ever broadcast. Complete with a dress made from a curtain rod, they spoofed soap operas week after week. They rebuilt famous films, mimicked movie stars, and made fun of commercials while the products were still on shelves. Burnett's whole company built a decade of television out of taking other people's work and bending it. Her standing when the lawsuit landed was about as high as it gets. She had already received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and honors kept arriving in the years afterward, including recognition for lifetime achievement in comedy. She was not a fading performer fighting for attention. She was an institution, which is exactly why the show reached for her in the first place. That points at how this series picks targets in the first place. The joke only functions because the audience holds Carol Burnett in high regard. Swap in a performer with a rough reputation, and the scene collapses, because there is no distance between the person and the setting. The show needed somebody spotless. Her clean record was the raw material. The case also became a small warning to everyone else. Watching a beloved television legend take a network to federal court and lose in under 3 months told every other celebrity considering the same move exactly what the odds looked like. In the years afterward, plenty of famous people complained publicly about how the show had used them. Almost none of them filed anything. Burnett herself has said little about it since. She has been asked about the case in interviews over the years and has generally kept her answers short, making the point that her objection was about her character being placed in that setting rather than about being made fun of at all, which is consistent with everything her filing argued. The show, for its part, never treated the episode as a mistake. Peter Rodica still runs in syndication and still streams with the scene intact. The charwoman is still mopping that floor, the altered theme music is still playing under her, and the joke about the ear tug is still there. Every element the lawsuit identified survived, because the court said it could. What that whole fight left behind is a strange kind of proof about how the series operates. Family Guy did not build a full episode around Carol Burnett. It did not write her a storyline or invite her in to voice herself. It used her for 5 seconds as background scenery, attached her most beloved creation to the dirtiest possible setting, and then treated her legal response as further material. The show risked millions of dollars in damages over a joke most viewers would have forgotten by the next commercial break, and won. That outcome is the reason this story belongs first in this video. Everything that follows, the actor who let himself be crated up, the movie star chased off a monument, the politician's family, the rumor that turned into a viral clip 12 years later, all of it happens in a world where a federal judge already told this show that it could keep going. That ruling arrived in the middle of the series, rather than at the end of it, which matters. The show had roughly 7 seasons behind it in 2007 and has produced well over a dozen since. Every celebrity joke that followed was written by people who knew exactly how much protection they were operating under, and how little a famous name could do about it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Carol Burnett fought the show from the outside and lost. Another famous face took the opposite path, walking straight into Quahog and letting the writers turn him into a lunatic who could be lured into a wooden crate with a trail of candy. He kept coming back for more, and the town eventually named its high school after him. Section 2. The actor who became a recurring villain. James Woods, a working Hollywood actor, let a cartoon turn him into a monster, then came back 4 more times to be humiliated worse than the last time. He lost a friendship, lost his identity, lost his life, came back from the dead, and finally lost the high school that carried his name. All of it happened to a version of himself that he voiced personally. The choice of James Woods was never random, and the joke only works for people who know what the man's actual career looked like. He built a reputation across decades as one of the most intense performers in American film. The actor-directors called when a role needed someone who seemed permanently 3 seconds away from an explosion. He earned Academy Award nominations for Salvador and for Ghosts of Mississippi, worked with some of the biggest directors of his era in films including Once Upon a Time in America and Casino, and picked up Emmy recognition for television work. He was also known publicly for being sharp and highly combative in interviews, a combination that made him unusually easy to caricature. That is the raw material the show used. The Family Guy version of James Woods works as a heightened take on one specific public image, an intelligent, wound-up man whose intensity has nowhere useful to go. Every joke in the character depends on the audience already sensing that the real actor is a little too much, which is a difficult thing to build a running gag out of unless the person involved is willing to laugh at it. His name also sat in the background of the series long before he ever recorded anything for it. The high school in Quahog carried his name in early seasons as a throwaway joke, a small piece of set dressing that most viewers never questioned. The show then went back and built an actual character out of a name it had already been using, which is why his presence in the town always felt more established than a normal guest appearance. That naming habit is a small running joke in its own right. Quahog's institutions are named after an odd collection of real people. The elementary school carries the name of the comedian and musician Martin Mull. The junior high is named for Buddy Cianci, the longtime mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, whose career included a federal racketeering conviction. The high school, until 2019, belonged to James Woods. The town's own map is a joke about how American communities hand out permanent honors to whoever happens to be locally famous, without much thought about what those names will mean in 20 years. The relationship with the actor himself started in an episode called Peter's Got Woods, the 11th episode of the 4th season, written by Danny Smith and originally broadcast on September 11th, 2005. The episode arrived a week earlier than planned because Fox had pushed back a different Family Guy episode out of sensitivity for Hurricane Katrina victims, since that episode leaned heavily on jokes about tropical storms. Peter's Got Woods was also rated TV PG rather than the TV 14 rating most episodes of the series carried, which is a small oddity for an episode that would kick off one of the longest-running celebrity grudges in the show's history. The story starts with Brian dating a schoolteacher named Shauna Parks, played by Gabrielle Union, which leaves Peter feeling abandoned by his best friend. Brian offers to help her get the local high school renamed after Martin Luther King Jr. Peter opposes the renaming for no reason beyond being annoyed with Brian, and hunts down James Woods himself to help him fight it. That structure is why the episode still works. The proposal at the center of it is something nobody could reasonably argue against. Peter is not making a point, and he is not arguing about history or legacy. He is jealous of a dog, and a real Hollywood actor agreed to voice a version of himself who helps a jealous idiot block a memorial, because the writers asked and he thought it was funny. What follows is where the show found its angle. Rather than writing Woods as a cameo or a punchline, the writers turned him into a needy, obsessive, faintly menacing best friend for Peter. He replaces Brian in Peter's life, then becomes possessive about it, exploding at Peter for showing up 5 minutes late to dinner. The escalation follows the exact shape of a bad relationship, and Woods played every second of it himself, letting his own famously intense screen presence get used as the engine of the joke. The way Peter and Brian finally solved the problem became the single most repeated image of the whole running gag. They lay out a trail of Reese's Pieces on the ground, borrowing directly from E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and Woods follows the candy one piece at a time, delighted, announcing each one out loud, until he walks straight into a wooden crate. The crate then gets sealed and wheeled into an enormous government warehouse full of identical crates, where a voice explains that top men will be studying it. That ending copies the closing shot of Raiders of the Lost Ark almost exactly, treating a working actor as a dangerous artifact that needs locking away from the public. The candy trap turned into the most repeated piece of the whole arrangement. The image of a respected film actor slowly walking toward a box, announcing each individual piece of candy out loud with mounting delight, became one of the most quoted moments in the show's history. It gets reused, referenced, and imitated constantly, and it worked so well the writers repeated it beat for beat in the follow-up episode purely so Peter could point out that they should have started with it. Most shows would have left it there. Family Guy filed him away as a permanent part of the town instead. His name stayed on the high school. A wooded area outside Quahog was named after him in another episode. He became Geography. He returned in the 6th season episode Back to the Woods, first broadcast on February 17, 2008. This time, the show gave him a revenge plot. Peter loses his wallet at a Barry Manilow concert, and Woods finds it. Rather than returning it, he uses the driver's license, the social security card, the passport, and the property paperwork inside to legally become Peter Griffin. He takes over the house. He takes over the family. He puts a photograph of his own face over Peter's in the wedding picture on the wall. Joe Swanson, a police officer who has known Peter for years, accepts the paperwork and treats Woods as the real Peter, which is exactly the kind of logic the show runs on. Peter's counterattack is the part that turned the episode into a favorite. Brian encourages him to steal Woods' identity right back, so Peter starts making public appearances as James Woods and destroying his reputation on purpose. He books an appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman and announces, in character as Woods, that he is starring in a comedy about the September 11 attacks alongside David Spade. The real Woods, watching this happen to his own name and face, has no way to stop it. The episode then ends the exact same way the first one did, with candy on the ground and a crate, and Peter noting out loud that they should probably skip straight to the candy next time. Woods came back again for Brian Griffin's House of Pain, and then the show did something no celebrity guest normally agrees to. Then There Were Fewer opened the 9th season as a full-length murder mystery, presented in a different visual style from the rest of the series, with the cast gathered at a remote mansion and picked off one at a time. The show used that episode to permanently remove several recurring characters, which it almost never does. James Woods was one of them, and the actor recorded his own character's final moments. Permanently lasted about 2 seasons. He turned up alive again in Tom Tucker, The Man in His Dream, and the explanation the writers invented says a great deal about their opinion of the industry they work in. A famous Hollywood actor, the show reasons, has access to medical care nobody else can get, and his recovery involved draining the life out of a young woman. That is a joke about celebrity itself, delivered by an actual celebrity, about his own resurrection. His last major appearance came in 2014, in the crossover episode where the Griffins visit Springfield. The Family Guy version of James Woods meets the version of James Woods who had appeared in The Simpsons years earlier, since Woods had also voiced himself on that show. 2 cartoon versions of the same living actor stood next to each other on screen, both of them him. The whole arrangement depended on something the show could never have manufactured by itself, which is an actor secure enough to hear a pitch about being lured into a crate with candy and say yes without asking for changes. Most performers at that level protect their public image carefully, and their representatives protect it harder. Woods handed his over for 14 years and asked for nothing back. He agreed to be portrayed as clingy, unhinged, criminal, and stupid enough to follow candy into a box twice. He agreed to be murdered. He agreed to be brought back through a joke about Hollywood vampirism. Every one of those decisions made the material land harder, because the voice coming out of the cartoon was the genuine article rather than an impression. Then the arrangement collapsed, and it collapsed over something happening outside the show entirely. Across the second half of the 2010s, the real James Woods became known less for acting and more for a combative political presence online, heavily followed and heavily criticized, and around the same period he publicly stepped back from the platform after a dispute over one of his posts. In May 2019, the show responded in the season 17 finale by having Brian propose renaming James Woods Regional High School, describing Woods as a political troll and a maniac on social media. The renaming passed within the first few minutes of the episode, and the school became Adam West High. What makes that removal notable is how rare it is. Television shows quietly stop writing for guest characters all the time. They do not usually build an episode around erasing a name from the fictional geography and explaining exactly why. Family Guy went back into its own established world, took the name off the map on screen, and moved on within about 90 seconds. A celebrity who had spent 14 years playing along found that the geography built around him could be taken back. The removal reframed everything that came before it. For most of those years, the running gag looked like a friendly arrangement between a show and an actor who enjoyed being the villain. The renaming episode revealed that the arrangement had limits and that the show would keep score on what a guest did outside the studio. James Woods spent nearly a decade and a half as one of the most fleshed-out celebrity presences in the entire series, with a school, a stretch of woods, a death, a resurrection, and a crossover appearance to his name. Then a single line about social media took the school away, and the man who had voiced every previous humiliation himself had no part in that one. There is a practical reason the character kept working across so many years, and it has to do with how little the show had to explain each time. A guest celebrity normally needs setting up. The audience has to be told who this person is, why they matter, and what the joke about them is supposed to be. Woods needed none of that after the first episode, because the show had already built him a history inside Quahog. The writers could drop him into a scene and the audience arrived with everything they needed. That is why he outlasted almost every other famous name the series touched. Most celebrity material in this show is disposable by design, built for one cutaway and then abandoned. Woods became a recurring antagonist with a personality, a grudge, and continuity between appearances, which is the treatment normally reserved for characters the writers invented themselves. The pattern also explains why the ending stung the way it did among fans. Removing a name from a school is a small piece of business inside a 22-minute episode, and the show treated it as exactly that. For anyone who had followed the character across 14 years, it read as the closing of a long story that had never been given a proper ending, delivered in a throwaway line about somebody's posting habits. Nothing else in the show's history quite matches that combination. A guest who becomes a place that outlives the guest, and a joke that ends with the place being taken away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The school Woods lost was renamed for a man who spent 17 years letting Quahog treat him as a complete lunatic. He wasted public money hunting down stolen water, sent the entire police force to another continent chasing a movie character, and cemented graves shut in case of zombies. He never once asked the writers to go easier on him. Section 3. The Batman Who Ran a Town, Adam West. For 17 years, one of the most recognizable actors in American television history let a cartoon present him as a soft-spoken madman with access to public funds. He voiced every line himself. He never asked for the character to be softened, and by the end of it, the joke had rebuilt his career. Adam West arrived at Family Guy carrying a very particular kind of fame. In 1966, he starred as Batman in the live-action series that ran for 3 seasons on ABC, playing the role completely straight inside a show built on bright colors, painted sound effects, and dialogue nobody could deliver without sounding ridiculous. The series launched in January of that year and ran twice a week, with a story beginning on one night and finishing on the next, which was an unusual scheduling experiment at the time. It became an immediate national craze, spun off a feature film within months, and pulled in a parade of major stars who wanted to play villains. Then it burned out almost as fast as it caught fire, and the show was gone by 1968. What remained was an actor in his late 30s who was, to the entire viewing public, permanently a man in a cowl. He described the years afterward openly in interviews, including the difficulty of being taken seriously for other roles, and the long stretch of personal appearances and small parts that followed. The 1966 series had been so specific in its tone, so committed to its own silliness, that audiences could not separate the performance from the person. What eventually pulled him out was a decision to stop fighting the image and start playing with it. Beginning in the 1990s, West took roles as exaggerated versions of himself in comedies and animated shows, leaning into the idea that Adam West was a slightly unhinged relic who took himself far too seriously. One of those appearances was on the Hanna-Barbera cartoon Johnny Bravo. Seth MacFarlane, working in that same building early in his career, found the performance funny enough that he wanted something similar for his own show. That idea became Mayor Adam West, who first appeared in the Season 2 episode 15 Minutes of Shame in 2000, an episode built around the Griffins getting their own reality television program. The character was introduced inside a story about ordinary people being turned into entertainment, which is a fitting entrance for a man about to spend 17 years being turned into a punchline. On paper, the character is the elected mayor of Quahog, Rhode Island. By the way, I do audio tags really well. In practice, he is a man operating under a permanent set of private delusions, and the comedy depends on a technique most cartoons cannot pull off. He never raises his voice, never signals that a joke is happening, and never acknowledges that anything he says is unusual. He explains that he keeps his money in a hollowed-out log, or that he is at war with an invisible enemy, using the exact tone a real mayor would use to discuss road repair. The gap between the delivery and the content is where every laugh lives. The catalog of what the show had him do with public money is long. In one episode, he spends $100,000 of taxpayer funds investigating who has been stealing his water, an inquiry he pursues with the seriousness of a murder case. In another, he sends the majority of the Quahog police force to South America to find Elaine Wilder, a character who exists only inside the film Romancing the Stone, apparently unaware that she is fictional. He commissions a gold statue of a breakfast cereal mascot. He has graves cemented shut because he believes the dead will otherwise get out. He delivers each of these decisions with the same calm authority. Because the character holds public office, the writers could aim him at anything. Local government, wasteful spending, corruption, and the general uselessness of the people who run small towns all became available without the show ever needing to build a political storyline. Mayor West could simply announce a decision, and the joke would arrive fully formed. The show also let him be strange in ways that had nothing to do with Batman. His obsessions, his private rituals, his terror of things that do not exist, and his ability to speak with total confidence while making no sense at all built a character who eventually stopped being a celebrity cameo and became one of the town's most recognizable residents. New viewers watching the middle seasons often had no idea the mayor was a real actor playing himself. The show then folded him into the family. Mayor West eventually married Carol, Lois Griffin's sister, which made one of the most famous actors in television history a permanent in-law inside the Griffin household. That decision mattered. because it meant West could no longer be written as an occasional cameo. He had a marriage, a job, a house, and a place at holiday dinners. He appeared in well over 100 episodes, which is more screen time than most of the show's original supporting characters received. None of that happens without the actor agreeing to it, and West agreed to all of it enthusiastically. Interviews from the period consistently describe him as delighted by the material rather than protective of his image. He recorded the lines himself for 17 years. He allowed the writers to portray him as delusional, cowardly, useless, occasionally dangerous, and completely unfit for the office he held, and he never asked them to explain that the real man was nothing like that. One detail captures the arrangement better than anything else. The show never once wrote an episode explaining that Mayor West was secretly competent, or secretly wise, or secretly in on the joke. Sitcoms almost always give a long-running comic character a moment of unexpected depth eventually, a scene where the fool turns out to understand something everyone else missed. Family Guy never bothered. The mayor was ridiculous in his first appearance and ridiculous in his last, across 17 years and more than 100 episodes, with no redemption arc and no explanation. Adam West apparently never asked for one either. The payoff was real. The role introduced him to millions of viewers who had never watched a single frame of the 1966 Batman series. Younger audiences knew him first as the mayor and only later learned about the cape. Convention bookings, voice work, and guest appearances followed. The performance became so recognizable inside the industry that the practice of a celebrity playing an exaggerated, self-mocking version of themselves picked up his name as its informal label. A man who had spent decades being defined by a role he could not escape ended up giving his name to the technique of escaping. The real Adam West died on June 9, 2017, at the age of 88, following a short battle with leukemia. Seth MacFarlane released a public statement calling him irreplaceable and saying the show had lost its mayor. Fox aired a tribute card before a rebroadcast of an episode centered on the character, and the following month the network ran a 9-minute reel of his best moments from across the series. The show itself said nothing in story for almost 2 years. Mayor West simply stopped appearing, with no episode explaining where he had gone, no funeral, and no farewell scene, which left a strange gap in a town where he had been a fixture since the second season. That silence was probably the only honest option available. Family Guy had lost guest voices before and had killed characters off before, but this was different because there was no way to recast him. The voice was the joke. Bringing in a sound-alike would have been its own kind of insult, and there were only so many recorded lines left to use. When the show finally addressed it, the explanation was simply that the mayor had died off-screen, which is the least dramatic option available to a series that stages elaborate deaths for entertainment. That restraint reads as deliberate. Inventing a comic death for the character would have meant making a joke out of the actual man's death, and even this show declined to do that. The gap closed on May 12, 2019, in the season 17 finale, an episode built around him from the first minute to the last. It opens with a scene shot in the style of a program filmed in front of a live studio audience, with Carol West appearing as a still grieving widow while an audience member keeps interrupting to shout about how attractive she is. That is the show's way of handling grief, which is to say it refuses to hold a serious moment for more than a few seconds at a time. The main plot has Brian proposing that Quahog's high school be renamed in the late mayor's honor. The proposal succeeds within the first few minutes, which frees up the rest of the episode for Brian's failed run for mayor against Quagmire. Before that takes over, the episode plays a tribute montage of Mayor West's greatest moments set to Right Here Waiting by Richard Marx, and it runs almost entirely straight, with no undercutting joke inside the montage itself, which is about as close to reverence as this program has ever come. The show then follows it immediately with footage of Peter attempting viral basketball trick shots that end in disaster. The end credits were the clearest signal of intent. The Family Guy theme was rearranged and performed in the style of the 1966 Batman theme, closing an episode about the mayor with the music that made the actor famous decades earlier. The whole thing was dedicated to him. The office did not stay empty forever. The show eventually installed a new mayor, a rural western cousin called Wild West, voiced by Sam Elliott, which allowed the town to keep a mayor without asking anyone to replace what Adam West had built. His own recorded work continued to surface after his death as well, with his final credited appearance arriving in an episode broadcast in 2020, 3 years after he died. There is a business detail behind all of this that rarely comes up. Recording a recurring role on an animated series is steady, well-paid work that requires a few hours in a booth rather than months on a set, and for an actor in his 70s and 80s, it amounted to a second income stream that came with no physical demands at all. West kept the job for 17 years, and the show kept writing for him long past the point where the original joke about his Batman fame had stopped being the reason anyone laughed. That shift is the part most people miss. By the middle seasons, the laugh no longer came from the Batman connection at all. It came from the mayor himself, a figure with his own history and his own recognizable rhythm. The celebrity joke had turned into an actual character, which almost never happens with this kind of casting. It is also the reason the show could not simply move on after he died. A celebrity cameo can be dropped without anyone noticing. A main cast member cannot, and by 20 2017, he was closer to the second category than the first. What Adam West left behind inside Family Guy is the strongest evidence available that being destroyed by this show was never automatically a bad outcome. Carol Burnett was used for 5 seconds and went to federal court. James Woods played along for 14 years and had his name scraped off a building. Adam West handed the writers a version of himself with no dignity attached, kept handing it to them for 17 years, and got a second career, a marriage into the main cast, a tribute montage, a rearranged theme song, and a high school out of it. The character worked because the actor understood something the show could not have manufactured on its own. Mayor West is only funny if the audience knows there is a real, dignified, famous man behind the voice choosing to sound like this. Strip that away, and the character is another loud cartoon lunatic in a town already full of them. Adam West supplied the one ingredient nobody else could supply, which was Adam West agreeing to it. A man who spent 30 years trying to escape one role signed up for another that offered him no dignity at all, and turned it into the thing people loved him for. By the end, the character had outgrown the reference that created him. Anyone who started watching in the middle seasons met a strange little man running a town before they ever met a superhero, which reversed the order his whole career had been stuck in since 1966. 17 years of being the punchline bought him something no serious role ever had, which was a place in the everyday lives of people who were not alive when he wore the cape. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every famous name got the chance to say yes first. One movie star found out what the show thought of him through a car chase, a stolen film reel, and a house built on top of Mount Rushmore. The joke aimed at him looked cruel in 2005. A year later, it looked like the writers had seen something coming. Section 4, The Movie Star, and the Sequel That Never Was, Mel Gibson. The show came back from the dead in 2005, and the first thing it did with its second life was pick a fight with one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, over the most sensitive subject available, in the episode that had to prove the whole revival was worth it. Nothing about that revival was normal for television. Fox had canceled Family Guy in 2002, after 3 seasons of poor ratings, having moved the show around the schedule repeatedly and dropped it into difficult time slots against strong competition. It was finished. Then Cartoon Network began running the old episodes late at night on its adult programming block, and those reruns pulled bigger numbers than anything else on the channel. At the same time, the DVD sets turned into one of the best-selling television releases of the era, passing 3 million copies. Fox looked at both sets of numbers and did something almost unheard of, which was to order new episodes of a program it had already killed. That put unusual pressure on the writers. The audience responsible for the rescue had saved the show specifically because of how far it was willing to go, which meant a cautious, crowd-pleasing return would have been a betrayal of the exact people who brought it back. Whatever the premiere did, it had to signal within 10 minutes that nothing had been sanded down during the time away. The premiere was North by North Quahog, written by Seth MacFarlane, directed by Peter Shin, and first broadcast on May 1st, 2005. The structure borrows from the Alfred Hitchcock thriller North by Northwest, which is where the title comes from, and the plot is straightforward enough on paper. Peter and Lois take a second honeymoon to save their marriage, Peter crashes the car while reading a comic book behind the wheel, and the repair bill wipes out their entire budget. Stranded, Peter remembers that Mel Gibson keeps a private suite at a luxury hotel nearby that he barely ever uses, and talks his way into the room by pretending to be Gibson himself. Inside the suite, Peter stumbles into a private screening room and finds a finished film nobody outside the building has seen. It is a sequel to The Passion of the Christ, titled Passion of the Christ 2, Crucify This. Peter decides that the world cannot be subjected to another 2 hours of Mel Gibson religious material, steals the reel, and starts the chase that carries the rest of the episode. The fake sequel itself is a small masterpiece of construction. The trailer arrives with the booming, gravel voice narration style that dominated American film advertising for decades, the kind of voice audiences associate with summer blockbusters. It presents the follow-up as a loud action comedy, pairing a religious drama with the beats of a buddy picture, and closes with a tagline built around a line from scripture twisted into an action movie boast. Everything about it is designed to sound like a real trailer that a real studio spent real money on, which is what makes the premise land. Understanding why this was an aggressive choice rather than a safe one takes a look at where Mel Gibson stood in 2005. He had won Academy Awards as a director. He had one of the most bankable action careers of the previous 20 years. He had just financed a subtitled religious drama with his own money that went on to earn hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide after most of Hollywood assumed it would fail, turning The Passion of the Christ into one of the most profitable independent films ever made and dominating cultural conversation for months. He had also become a symbol inside a much larger argument. The film drew sustained criticism from religious groups and scholars who said its portrayal of Jewish characters revived old and dangerous ideas, and that criticism intensified because of public statements made by Gibson's father. He was defended just as fiercely by people who felt the whole attack was unfair. Walking into that fight in 2005 meant guaranteed complaints from at least one direction and probably both. Family Guy went straight at it. During the hotel sequence, Lois objects to the theft by pointing pointing out that taking Mel Gibson's towels, his bathrobes, and his Nazi memorabilia is one thing, but stealing a finished multi-million-dollar film is another matter entirely. That line does not sneak the accusation in through a side door. It states it in passing, as an established fact about the character, and then moves on to the next joke as though it were nothing. The approach itself is worth a closer look. The show never argues about the theology of the film, never engages with the substance of the criticism, and never explains the controversy to the audience. It states its position through set dressing. A hotel room contains towels, bathrobes, and memorabilia, and the memorabilia carries the writer's opinion. That is an enormously efficient piece of comedy writing, and it is also the reason the joke was so hard to argue with. There is no thesis to rebut. There is only a prop in a room. The chase escalates from there. Peter drives through a shopping mall pursued by Gibson's people, mirroring a famous sequence from the Blues Brothers down to the music choice. The pursuit ends at Mount Rushmore, where the show places Gibson's private home directly on top of the monument, presenting him as a man wealthy and self-important enough to live above the carved faces of 4 American presidents. The confrontation there ends with Gibson going off the edge. The Mount Rushmore gag works on the same logic as the hotel room. The show never says out loud that Mel Gibson considers himself a historic figure on the level of American presidents. It simply puts his house on top of their heads and lets the image do the talking. Then the writers add one final layer. Gibson survives the fall, and the reason given is his own religious devotion, which sits alongside a running joke about how his audience will accept anything from him. The episode moves past mocking a movie and lands on the relationship between the man, the film, and the audience that had made all three untouchable. Fox aired it without cutting a frame, and it worked. North by Northquahog is still regularly named among the strongest premieres the series ever produced, both for the confidence of the writing and for the fact that a show returning from cancellation opened by attacking a subject most comedies were carefully avoiding. What happened afterward changed how the episode reads. In July 2006, roughly 14 months after the premiere aired, Mel Gibson was arrested for drunk driving in Malibu and, during that arrest, made a string of anti-Semitic statements to the arresting deputies. The story dominated news coverage for weeks. Gibson apologized publicly, sought treatment, and spent years working his way back toward mainstream acceptance in Hollywood. That timeline turned a cartoon joke into something people kept revisiting. Family Guy had put the accusation on screen, in the form of a throwaway line about memorabilia in a hotel room more than a year before the arrest that made the subject impossible to ignore. The show had not uncovered anything. It had taken a rumor and a controversy already in circulation and stated it as settled fact, which is a completely different thing from investigation. But the effect on the audience was the same. The joke stopped looking like a cheap shot and started looking like a prediction. The episode also set the template for how the show handles religion generally, which caused it far more trouble over the following 2 decades than any single celebrity ever did. Family Guy does not argue with belief. It treats religious figures as characters, gives Jesus a recurring role as a slightly disappointing house guest, and builds jokes out of the entertainment industry that grows around faith rather than out of faith itself. The target here is a movie, a studio, a marketing campaign, and a star who had turned all three into an empire. That distinction did not spare the show from complaints, and it never has, but it did give the writers a defensible position, which is more than they usually bother arranging before they start writing. Gibson stayed in the rotation for years afterward, surfacing in cutaways and references whenever the writers needed shorthand for a particular kind of Hollywood figure. That longevity is unusual. Most celebrity jokes in this series burn out within a season or two because the reference stops being current. This one kept working because the underlying story kept developing in public. The last twist arrived 20 years later. Gibson began work on a real sequel to The Passion of the Christ, and coverage of that production pulled the old clip straight back into circulation, with audiences pointing out that a cartoon had invented the movie 2 decades before anyone announced it. The specifics are nothing alike. The basic premise is identical. A parody normally dies when the thing it parodies leaves the conversation, and this one kept getting resurrected by the subject himself. What makes this particular takedown different from the others in the show's history is how little the target ever engaged with it. Carol Burnett sued. James Woods voiced himself for 14 years. Adam West built a second career out of it. Mel Gibson said nothing publicly about any of it, which left the show free to keep going without any friction at all. The episode opens with a joke aimed at the network rather than the movie star. Before the plot begins, Peter runs through a long list of programs Fox kept on the air while Family Guy was canceled, naming failure after failure, and the list keeps going well past the point where a normal show would cut away. That sequence set the tone for everything after it. The premiere was not going to pretend the cancellation had never happened, and it was not going to be gracious about the network that ordered it. The impersonation at the center of the plot is doing more work than it first appears. Peter gains access to a luxury suite purely by claiming a famous name, and nobody at the hotel checks. No identification, no confirmation, no hesitation. The show is making a small point about how celebrity actually functions in practice, which is that the name alone opens doors that ordinary people cannot walk through, and that the system protecting a star is far flimsier than anyone assumes. That idea returns at the end when Gibson survives a fall from a national monument. The joke depends on the audience already believing that famous people operate under different rules, including the laws of physics. Family Guy has returned to that idea across its entire run, but this episode states it most plainly, because the man it is stating it about was, at that exact moment, one of the most protected figures in the industry. Audiences turned out for it. The premiere pulled a strong number for a show that had spent 3 years off the air, and the ratings across that 4th season justified every decision Fox had made in bringing it back. The revival was not a sentimental gesture toward a cult audience. It became one of the most valuable properties the network owned, and it stayed that way for the next 2 decades. The episode also ignores the actual film it is built around, completely and on purpose. Nobody in the story watches The Passion of the Christ, discusses its content, or explains what happens in it. The movie exists purely as an object to be stolen, a reel in a can that Peter carries around while being chased. That treatment says more about the show's opinion of the whole controversy than any joke in the script does, because it reduces a film that occupied months of national argument to a prop in a chase sequence. The episode has aged into an odd position because of it. Later coverage of Gibson's career tends to treat the 2006 arrest as the turning point that changed how audiences saw him. Family Guy had already sketched that version of the man on screen more than a year earlier, without evidence, purely on the strength of what people in the industry were already saying. What that episode left behind is the clearest statement of intent the show ever made about famous people. Every comedy says that celebrities are ridiculous. This one was saying something narrower, which is that the bigger the protection around a person, the more attractive they become as a target, and that a joke landing a year before the news catches up is worth more than a joke landing a year after. A show brought back by fan demand could easily have spent its first episode thanking the audience and playing the hits. Instead, the writers picked the largest fight available, and the ratings that followed proved the audience had returned for exactly that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Attacking a movie star over a film is one thing. 4 years later, the show invited a man acquitted of double murder into Quahog for an entire episode, tried to rehabilitate his reputation on screen, and let him play golf with Peter. Viewers who made it through that episode then had to sit through 3 straight minutes of a dead country singer. Section 5. The Acquitted Superstar. O.J. Simpson. 15 years after the most watched criminal trial in American history, Family Guy built an entire episode around the man at the center of it, brought him to Quahog, moved him in next door, and asked the audience to spend 22 minutes deciding whether he should be forgiven. The episode is called The Juice is Loose, the 9th episode of the 7th season, written by Andrew Goldberg, directed by Cindy Tang, and first broadcast on March 15, 2009. It opens with a title card explaining that this is one of several lost episodes recently discovered in the Griffin basement. That framing is more than a gag. The episode had sat unaired for a while before it reached the schedule, and the card is the show admitting, in its own way, that the material had been difficult to place. The setup is simple. Peter finds a raffle ticket from 1989 that he never cashed in, and the prize is a round of golf with a celebrity of his choosing. He picks O.J. Simpson, because in 1989 that choice would have been completely unremarkable. Simpson at that point was a Hall of Fame running back turned commercial pitchman turned comedy actor, one of the most broadly liked famous people in the country. What Peter has apparently forgotten is everything that happened after 1989. Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman were murdered in June 1994. The slow pursuit of the white Bronco along the Los Angeles freeway system interrupted a live championship basketball broadcast and was watched by tens of millions of people. The criminal trial ran for months, turned every participant into a household name, and ended in October 1995 with an acquittal that split the country almost exactly along lines nobody in television wanted to discuss out loud. In 1997, a civil jury reached the opposite conclusion, finding him liable for the deaths and ordering damages running into the tens of millions of dollars. That contradiction is the space the episode works in. Peter is technically correct that the man was acquitted. Everyone else in Quahog is reacting to the other verdict. Family Guy walked directly into all of it. Peter plays his round of golf, enjoys the man's company, and brings him home to meet the family. Simpson is written as warm, funny, and likable, which is the entire engine of the episode. He is not portrayed as a monster. He is pleasant company, and the discomfort comes from how easy the show makes it to enjoy him. Mike Henry's performance is the reason that holds together. Simpson did not voice himself. The part went to a series regular, best known on the show as Cleveland Brown, and he plays it with genuine warmth rather than menace, giving the character the easy charm the real man was known for during his years as a broadcaster and pitchman. Without that, the middle stretch of the episode collapses, because the audience has to actually enjoy his company for the ending to mean anything. The town does not agree. Mayor Adam West leads an angry mob to the Griffin house. Neighbors demand that Peter get rid of him. Every character who is normally too stupid or too self-absorbed to have an opinion about anything suddenly has a firm one. Peter, who has spent the entire series being wrong about everything, ends up as the only person in Quahog arguing that a man acquitted in court deserves to be treated as innocent. That reversal reversal is what the episode is actually about. The show hands its dumbest character the position the legal system reached, then spends the rest of the running time letting the audience feel how badly they want him to be wrong. Peter's plan for fixing the situation is to throw a party where the town can meet Simpson properly and change their minds. It half works. People warm up to him. The episode moves towards something that looks like redemption, with a former pariah slowly being accepted back into ordinary life by people who had judged him from a distance. Then the show detonates the whole thing. Simpson snaps and attacks several partygoers with a knife, which resolves the question the episode has been dangling for 20 minutes in the bluntest way available. The joke is not subtle and was never meant to be. Everything the episode builds exists, so the ending can knock it down. That landing is also the safest possible choice for an episode that spent 20 minutes taking real risks. Having Simpson turn violent lets the audience off the hook completely. Nobody has to leave the episode holding an uncomfortable thought about acquittal or public judgment, because the show confirms the popular verdict in the final minute. A braver version of the same script ends without confirming anything. The episode leans hard on the physical evidence the country memorized during the trial. The glove, the Bronco, the courtroom theatrics, all of it turns up as material, because those images had been replayed so many times that they worked as shorthand nobody needed explained. 15 years after the verdict, a comedy writer could put a glove on screen, and the entire audience arrived at the same place instantly. One extended sequence goes further than shorthand. The killings are presented as an opera, staged and sung, with details rearranged for comic effect. The show also brought in Kathy Kalin Ryan to voice a member of Ron Goldman's family in a cutaway. Building a musical set piece around a real double homicide and reaching into the family of one of the victims for material took the episode past commentary on a celebrity and into the lives of people who never chose any of this. That is the criticism that stuck hardest at the time, and the one the show never really answered. Reaction split along predictable lines. Some critics defended it as the show doing exactly what it does, taking the most uncomfortable subject available and refusing to blink. Others argued that a double murder was not raw material for a sitcom plot regardless of how the ending resolved. The audience turned up either way, with the broadcast watched in more than 7 million homes. The episode drew separate complaints for something with no connection to Simpson at all. Buried in the middle of it sits a roughly 3-minute uninterrupted clip of the country singer Conway Twitty performing, dropped in as a distraction. Viewers who had settled in for a controversial episode about a murder trial instead found themselves watching several minutes of a music performance from decades earlier, and that segment ended up on multiple lists of moments that made longtime fans give up on the show entirely. The episode squeezes in a quick swipe at the competition, with a version of Homer Simpson appearing courtesy of voice actor Jeff Bergman, which was Family Guy reminding everyone that it had a rivalry running with the other famous animated family on the same network. That joke sits inside an episode about a double homicide, which is a fair summary of how this program organizes its priorities. The episode occupies an odd position in the show's history because of how few programs were willing to go near the subject at all by 2009. The case had been picked over by news networks, documentaries, and dramas for years, but almost always in a serious register, treated as a story about race, wealth, policing, and the legal system. Comedy had largely left it alone once the initial wave of monologue jokes passed in the mid-90s. Family Guy picked it back up and put it inside a family sitcom plot, with a golf outing, a neighborhood party, and a husband trying to convince his wife that his new friend is fine. Presenting one of the most argued about criminal cases in modern history as a story about an awkward houseguest strips away every serious frame the subject had been given. When Simpson died in April 2024, the episode came back into circulation almost immediately, and the way it read had changed. Coverage of his death was largely unsentimental, with little of the softening that usually follows the death of a famous athlete. Against that, a 15-year-old cartoon that had let him be charming for 18 minutes looked strangely generous, and a number of writers pointed out that a comedy show had given him something closer to a fair hearing than most obituaries did. One more layer sits underneath all of it, and it concerns Quahog rather than Simpson. The mob that forms outside the Griffin house is made up of characters the show has spent years establishing as morally worthless. Quagmire, Mayor West, and the rest of the town have no standing whatsoever to judge anyone, and the writers know it. Watching that particular group of people mount a campaign about justice is its own joke running underneath the main one. That choice complicates the ending rather than cleaning it up. The town turns out to be right about Simpson, but the town is right by accident, driven by the same mob instinct it applies to everything else. Nobody in the episode reasons their way to the correct answer. They arrive at it because a crowd told them to, which is a considerably darker point than anything the ending appears to be making on the surface. The show also never lets Peter learn anything. He spends the episode defending a man on the basis of a court verdict he does not understand, discovers he was wrong in the worst possible way, and by the following week the entire thing has been forgotten. That refusal to let events land is standard for the series, but here it means an episode about one of the most consequential trials in American history closes with no consequence at all. Watching it now, the strangest part is how confident the writing is. There is no hedging in the script, no attempt to soften the premise for a network audience, and no disclaimer anywhere in the running time. The show decided that 15 years was long enough, and then behaved as though the decision was obvious. The timing added an extra layer nobody involved could have planned around. By the time the episode reached the air in March 2009, the real Simpson was in prison in Nevada, convicted in an unrelated case involving an armed confrontation in a Las Vegas hotel room, and sentenced to a term that could have kept him inside for decades. A show that had shelved the episode for a while ended up broadcasting a story about whether the man deserved a second chance, at almost the exact moment the legal system had removed him from public life for a completely different reason. That coincidence is part of why the episode landed as awkwardly as it did. Audiences watching in 2009 were not being asked to consider an open question. They were being asked to consider a man who was, at that moment, sitting in a Nevada prison cell, which made the party scene in Quahog feel less like a thought experiment and more like a joke told at the expense of someone who had already lost. None of that changes the basic transaction at the center of the episode. Family Guy took the most notorious criminal case in modern American history, built a plot around the possibility of forgiving the man at the center of it, pulled a grieving family into the joke along the way, and finished with a knife punchline. One last detail says a lot about how the show viewed the whole exercise. The title of the episode borrows a phrase used in the coverage of the Bronco Pursuit, a piece of language that entered American speech during those days in June 1994 and stayed there. The writers did not invent a title. They reached for the wording the country already had because the country had been saying it for 15 years. That is the shortest possible summary of the whole exercise. It does not create anything new about the case, offer a fresh reading of it, or add information. It takes the shorthand already sitting in everyone's memory, the glove, the Bronco, the verdict, the phrase, and rearranges it into a sitcom plot. What the Juice is Loose left behind is the clearest example of the show using a celebrity as a test aimed at the audience rather than as a target. Carol Burnett was scenery. Mel Gibson was a chase. Simpson was a question about what viewers actually believed regarding a verdict most of them had already decided was wrong. The episode has never been quietly retired either. It still streams, still turns up in syndication, and still surfaces whenever the case returns to the news. The show never answered that question honestly, of course. It answered with a knife and a punchline, because answering any other way would have required the kind of sincerity Family Guy spends every episode avoiding. The episode is not measuring guilt, it is measuring how quickly a likable performance can soften an audience's judgment, and the answer it arrives at is about 9 minutes. Every other name in this video was chosen for what they represented. This one was chosen for what he did not represent to a young audience, which is a strange qualification for the most repeated musical performance in the show's history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The country singer who interrupted that episode had been dead for 16 years when the show started using him, and he had no say in any of it. His performances became the show's favorite weapon, deployed whenever a character needed to escape trouble, and the writers let them run long enough that walking away became part of the joke. Section 6. The country legend used as a human shield. Conway Twitty. A man who died in 1993 became one of the most frequently used performers on a cartoon that started airing 6 years later. He never agreed to any of it, never recorded a line, and never had a character designed for him. The show simply took footage of him performing and used it as a weapon against its own audience. Conway Twitty was born Harold Lloyd Jenkins on September 1st, 1933, and became one of the most successful recording artists in the history of American country music. He held the record for the most #1 singles by any act, with 55 chart-topping country hits, a record that stood until George Strait passed it in 2006. He built a long partnership with Loretta Lynn, collecting a run of Country Music Association awards for their duets through the first half of the 1970s. He was a member of the Grand Ole Opry and was inducted into both the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Rockabilly Hall of Fame. His early rock and roll recordings sounded so much like Elvis Presley that listeners assumed the name was a pseudonym Presley was using. He was successful enough to build a tourist attraction around his home in Tennessee that drew visitors from across the country. He died on June 5, 1993, at 59 years old. None of that background appears anywhere in Family Guy, which is exactly the point. The writers reached for Conway Twitty precisely because most of the audience had no idea who he was. The mechanics of the gag are the same every time. A character finds themselves caught doing something indefensible, or a joke lands so badly that the scene cannot continue. Rather than write a way out, the character turns to face the camera and announces Conway Twitty as though introducing an act at a variety show. The scene cuts to genuine archive footage of Twitty performing, and the show plays the song. Not a clip, not a few bars under dialogue. The performance, running at length while the plot sits frozen and waits. The first television use came in an episode called Peter's Daughter, broadcast in November 2007. Meg has been left at the altar after a pregnancy scare, and Peter, having pushed the whole wedding forward, apologizes to her. Then he points out that the assembled guests are still expecting a show, turns to the camera, and introduces Conway Twitty. The performance that follows is Hello Darlin', one of Twitty's signature recordings. Seth MacFarlane has said he was not in the room when the writers first landed on the idea, and that the decision to let the footage run for an uncomfortably long time came from the staff rather than from him. That detail matters, because the length is the entire joke. A short cutaway to an an old country performance is mildly funny. 3 minutes of it, with no cutaways, no interruptions, and no acknowledgement, is something else entirely. The most notorious use came in the O.J. Simpson episode, where Peter needs to escape trouble at home and reaches for the same escape hatch. The clip runs close to 3 uninterrupted minutes inside an episode already carrying a double murder plot. Critics singled it out immediately, and the segment has appeared on list after list of the moments that made longtime viewers quit the show entirely. What makes the gag unusual is who it targets. Almost every other celebrity joke in the show's history aims at the famous person. This one aims at the viewer. Twitty himself is not mocked. His singing is not altered, mimicked, or made ridiculous. He performs perfectly well. The comedy comes entirely from making an audience sit through something they did not choose, in a show they turned on for fast jokes, and refusing to release them. That is also why it works as a defense mechanism inside the story. The characters use Conway Twitty the way a person changes the subject at a dinner table after saying something horrifying. The show establishes the rule early, and then repeats it until the announcement alone signals to the audience that somebody has said something the writers do not want to deal with. The gag fits into a tradition the series had already built. Family Guy has always enjoyed jokes that outlast their own welcome on purpose. The fights between Peter and the giant chicken run for minutes at a time, spanning multiple locations and vehicles, long past the point where any punchline could justify the running time. The scene where Peter injures his leg and lies on the ground hissing in pain, uninterrupted, works on the same principle. The comedy comes from the refusal to cut away. Conway Twitty is the most extreme version of that idea, because during those 3 minutes the show is not even showing its own material. Family Guy is not on television. A country music performance from decades earlier is on television, and the audience is being asked to sit there and take it. The split it caused among viewers follows directly from that. The appeal of this series has always been speed, jokes stacked so tightly that anyone who looks away misses 3 of them. Fans who tuned in for that pace were handed the opposite experience without warning, and reviewers at the time wrote about it as a stunt that stopped being funny halfway through. The practical side of the gag is easy to overlook. Playing a full musical performance inside a network television episode is not free. Somebody had to clear the footage, license the recording, and sign off on the use, which means the joke about wasting the audience's time was itself an expense the studio agreed to pay repeatedly. The show was buying minutes of someone else's work in order to give the audience nothing. The writers also understood something about how television audiences behave. A viewer who is bored will usually change the channel, and a show that deliberately bores its audience is taking a real risk with its ratings. Family Guy took that risk across multiple seasons because the staff was confident that enough people would stay in their seats out of sheer disbelief. For the most part, they were right, and the ones who left made lists about it afterward. A generational gap does a lot of work here as well. The core audience for the show in the late 2000s was young, and a substantial portion of it had never heard a Conway Twitty record. The joke depends entirely on that unfamiliarity. If everyone watching had loved the man's music, the interruption would have played as a treat rather than a punishment. Twitty kept coming back. In Bill and Peter's Bogus Journey, he appears twice, including one instance where an unrelated farmer introduces the performance to cover for a joke in poor taste. In the episode 3 Acts of God, God himself tells Peter that Conway Twitty has requested the recurring bits stop. In another episode, a young Peter starts playing one of Twitty's biggest recordings on a home video, and his adult self cuts it off, dismissing the whole thing as annoying. The most direct acknowledgement arrives in a flash forward, where an elderly Peter is dying and sees people from the show who have already passed on. Twitty is among them. Peter reports that Twitty is angry about the years of gags, then notices something that makes him laugh, and the show resolves the moment by claiming the singer was fine with all of it after all. That is an unusual piece of business for a comedy to include. A show does not build an in-universe apology for a running joke, unless somebody involved was aware the joke had a real target, with a real family, and a real legacy behind it. The apology is delivered as another joke, naturally, but it exists, and the gag continued regardless. Twitty is not the only musician the show turned into furniture. Barry Manilow surfaces repeatedly as shorthand, most memorably in the episode where James Woods steals Peter's wallet at a Manilow concert, which places one celebrity joke inside another. Frank Sinatra Jr. took the opposite path entirely, voicing himself across several episodes and appearing as a mentor to Brian, most prominently in a story where Brian and Stewie put together a lounge act. He was a working musician with a complicated relationship to a legendary surname, and the show treated him with something close to warmth because he was in the room to shape how he came across. He died in 2016, and the episodes he recorded still play as affectionate. That comparison exposes the whole point. When a celebrity walks into the building, they get some say in the version of themselves that ends up on screen. When they have been dead for over a decade, they get none at all, and the show can decide that a Hall of Fame musician's job is to be the thing that makes an audience groan. The man on screen deserves better context than the joke gives him. He had a distinctive stage presence, sincere and unhurried, and that is the exact quality the show weaponized, because sincerity delivered slowly is the funniest possible thing to drop into a cartoon built on cynicism. His duets with Loretta Lynn are still played on country radio. His run at the top of the charts lasted decades. The gag also did something nobody involved intended. An entire generation of viewers who would never have listened to a country record from the 1970s learned his name from an adult cartoon, and a portion of them went looking for the music. Country radio hosts and music writers noticed the effect and wrote about it, sometimes with real irritation, since the introduction came packaged as a punchline about tedium. The catchphrase outlived the gag as well. The announcement gets repeated constantly online whenever somebody wants to change an awkward subject, and clips of the introduction have been shared far more widely than the performances that follow them. His name is now permanently attached to the idea of dodging a question, which is a strange legacy for a man whose actual work was earnest love songs. A broader point sits buried in that. Most of the famous names in this video were attacked for something they did, said, made, or were accused of. Conway Twitty did none of those things. He recorded love songs, toured, and died 6 years before the show existed. His only qualification for the role the writers gave him was that his performances looked dated enough to feel like an interruption, and that nobody was going to complain. A person does not need to have done anything to become material for this show. They only need to be recognizable enough to carry a joke and unable to do anything about it. What the Conway Twitty gag left behind is one of the strangest celebrity relationships in television. A Hall of Fame musician with 55 #1 records became, for millions of people, a running joke about stalling. He never appeared on the show, never approved anything, and never had the chance to object. For a certain generation, that is now the entire association. A decade of award-winning duets, a place in 2 halls of fame, and the first thing that comes to mind is a cartoon character turning to a camera to avoid a conversation. There is a question underneath all of this that the show never answers, which is why the writers kept going back to it after the complaints started. The obvious explanation is that annoying the audience on purpose became its own reward once the staff realized how strongly people reacted. A joke that produces groans, arguments, and articles is doing more work than a joke that produces a mild laugh, at least by the measure this show has always used. The gag also solved a structural problem the writers faced constantly. Family Guy builds episodes out of loosely connected pieces, and a story that runs short needs filling. Dropping in several minutes of licensed archive footage fills time perfectly, while doubling as a joke about filling time, which is the kind of double duty a writer's room rarely gets for free. That practical origin does not make the choice less strange. Plenty of shows have padding problems, and almost none of them solve those problems by handing several minutes of a network broadcast to a country singer who died before the series existed. The show has used many dead celebrities since, in cutaways lasting a second or two. None of them ever got 3 minutes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Using a dead singer as a shield costs a show nothing, because the dead cannot answer. Family Guy found that out the hard way on Valentine's Day 2010, when a single line of dialogue about a girl's mother pulled a former vice presidential nominee into a public fight, and the actress who delivered that line answered the complaint herself in a way nobody at the network could have scripted. Section 7, The Politician's Family, Sarah Palin. One line of dialogue, spoken by a teenage character on a date, produced a national argument involving a former governor, her daughter, a television advocacy group, a late-night political host, and an actress who ended up defending the show that put the line in her mouth. The episode is Extra Large Medium, the 12th episode of the 8th season, written by Steve Callahan, directed by John Holmquist, and broadcast on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2010. The main story follows Peter after Lois consults a psychic when Chris and Stewie go missing in the woods. Peter becomes convinced that he has real psychic ability and opens a business charging grieving people for readings, which the story treats as straightforward theft from people at the lowest point of their lives. Seth MacFarlane later described the point of it plainly, saying the episode was built around the position that psychics are frauds, which is an unusually direct stance for a program that normally avoids having positions at all. So the episode people argued about for a week was, structurally, a story about exploitation. The subplot that caused the argument was the part where the writers were being careful. That subplot has Chris meeting a girl named Ellen at school and asking her out. Ellen has Down syndrome, and she is voiced by Andrea Faye Friedman, an actress who has Down syndrome. It was her first voice acting role, but she was far from new to the business. By 2010, she had been working in television for close to 20 years. She had appeared in the drama series Life Goes On, one of the first American network programs to feature a main character with Down syndrome. She had starred in a film called Smudge, playing a young woman in a group home hiding a puppy, and that film won a Humanitas Prize. She had taken guest roles across a range of network dramas. She was a professional actress with a body of work, not somebody brought in as a novelty for one line. The character the writers gave her was not a gentle, inspirational figure. Ellen is pushy, demanding, and difficult. She slaps Chris repeatedly, criticizes him, orders him around, and pressures him into things he does not want to do. By the end of the subplot, Chris breaks up with her, having learned that a person with Down syndrome can be just as unpleasant as anyone else, which is the argument the episode is making underneath the jokes. During their dinner date, Chris asks what her parents do. Ellen answers that her father is an accountant and her mother is the former governor of Alaska. That line runs about about 3 seconds. In February 2010, there was exactly one person it could refer to. Sarah Palin had been the Republican vice presidential nominee 18 months earlier, had resigned as governor of Alaska in 2009, and was among the most discussed political figures in the country. Her youngest son, Trig, had been born in 2008 with Down syndrome, and she had spoken about him frequently and publicly, including on the campaign trail. Palin responded on her Facebook page, describing the episode as a kick in the gut. Her position was that using Down syndrome as the setup for a joke aimed at her family crossed from satire into cruelty, and that the real target was not her at all, but children with disabilities. Her daughter Bristol also responded publicly, calling the show's writers heartless. What happened next is the reason this particular controversy is still discussed. Andrea Faye Friedman sent an email to the New York Times and to other outlets, responding to Palin directly. Friedman wrote that she had been born with Down syndrome, that she had played the role, and that she found the line about the former governor of Alaska funny. She said the word for what the show had done was sarcasm. She said that in her family, laughing is considered a good thing, and that her parents had raised her to have a sense of humor and to live a normal life. Then she went further, saying her mother had not carried her around under her arm like a loaf of French bread the way she felt Palin carried Trig, looking for sympathy and votes. The New York Times printed only a short and inoffensive portion of that email. Political blogs published the whole thing within days, and the full version spread far more widely than the excerpt. That put Palin in an unusually difficult position. Her objection rested on the idea that people with Down syndrome were being used as material by writers who did not understand them. The performer at the center of the joke, who has Down syndrome, disagreed publicly and said she understood it perfectly well and thought it was good. Her response carried weight because it was not a defense of a show that had used her. It was an argument she had been making across an entire career, which is that people with Down syndrome are people, and that people can be rude, difficult, funny, and worth joking about. The other side of the argument had real force too, and it deserves stating fairly. Palin had spoken during the 2008 campaign about being an advocate for families raising children with special needs, and her son was a small child when the episode aired. Her position was that a young boy who had no part in political life was being pulled into a joke aimed at his mother, and that once a joke reaches a child, the target has moved from a public figure to a private one. Both of those positions can be true at the same time, which is exactly why the story ran for as long as it did. Newspapers, cable panels, and political blogs spent days on it. Bill Maher defended the episode on his own program. McFarlane defended it as well, and the argument the show's supporters made was consistent. Writing a character with Down syndrome as rude, manipulative, and hard to date treats her as a person rather than a symbol, and refusing to write her that way would be its own kind of condescension. Criticism also came from the Parents Television Council, which was the least surprising development in the entire sequence. That organization had spent years naming Family Guy among the worst programs on television, filing complaints about its content, and campaigning against its advertisers. Its objection here arrived as part of a long-running campaign rather than as a reaction to anything specific about this episode. What none of the criticism did was hurt the show. The broadcast was watched in roughly 6.5 million homes, the reviews were mostly favorable, and the episode has since been cited in discussions about disability representation more often as an example of getting something right than as an example of cruelty, largely because of who was in the recording booth. What makes this different from every other celebrity takedown in the show's history is the size of the weapon involved. The show did not build an episode around Sarah Palin. It did not caricature her, animate her, cast an impressionist, or write her a scene. It spent 3 seconds referencing her without naming her inside a subplot that was not about her at all, and that was enough to produce a week of national coverage. The tactical lesson inside that is the one that lasted. A joke which does not name its target is almost impossible to fight. Naming Sarah Palin would have given her something concrete to respond to and given the network something concrete to defend. Saying the words former governor of Alaska in a room where nobody says her name forced the target to identify herself in order to object at all. Responding to the joke confirmed it. That is the same instinct behind the Carol Burnett gag, the Mel Gibson hotel room, and half the celebrity material in this series. The show puts something small on screen, refuses to explain it, and lets the reaction do the amplification. A 3-second line reached vastly more people through the argument about it than it ever would have reached on its own. The way that argument traveled is a small snapshot of how media worked in early 2010. Palin did not hold a press conference or give an interview. She posted on Facebook, which was where she had been conducting most of her public communication since leaving office, and the post itself became the news story. Friedman did not call a publicist either. She sent an email to a newspaper and let the blogs carry it from there. Inside a week, the fight was happening between a Facebook page, an email chain, and a comment thread, with no press officer or network statement anywhere in it. That shift changed the shape of what a celebrity takedown could cost. A show that mocked a famous person in 1995 dealt with a newspaper column and a network complaint line. A show that mocked a famous person in 2010 could set off a fight that ran for a week across platforms nobody controlled, with the original 3-second clip attached to every version of the story. The show itself said nothing. Family Guy did not not write a follow-up joke about the controversy, did not reference Palin again the next week, and never acknowledged the argument on screen at all. That silence is a strategy rather than an accident. Responding would have turned a 3-second line into a running feud, given the other side something new to answer, and kept the story alive for another cycle. Saying nothing let the coverage burn itself out while the clip kept circulating. A harder point sits underneath all of it, and it explains why the episode still gets written about. The dispute ran between two views of what respect looks like, with a cartoon and a politician standing in for each side. One argued that a child with a disability should be protected from being used as material. The other, voiced by an actress with that exact disability, argued that being protected from jokes is its own way of being placed outside the room where everyone else is standing. Family Guy did not construct that argument thoughtfully. It stumbled into it while making a joke about a famous mother, then stood back and let the two sides fight, which is close to a perfect summary of how this show has always handled the people it goes after. The lasting piece of it belongs to Friedman rather than to the show. She made her case in her own words, without a publicist, against a former vice presidential nominee, and she was the only person in the entire argument speaking from direct experience of the condition being discussed. Family Guy wrote a line about a girl's mother and got handed one of the most interesting public arguments any of its jokes ever produced, and it came out of that week with more attention than the episode would ever have earned on its own. There is one more detail in the episode that rarely gets mentioned in the coverage of the fight. The subplot ends with Chris walking away from the relationship, and the show never suggests he was wrong to. A gentler program would have used the breakup to teach him something about patience or acceptance. This one lets him leave because she was difficult, which is the same ending any other Family Guy relationship subplot would get. That consistency is the strongest evidence for the show's own defense. Ellen is treated exactly the way the series treats every other character it puts in front of Chris, with no special handling, no lesson attached, and no music cue telling the audience how to feel. Whether that counts as respect or carelessness is precisely the argument the two sides were having. The timing of the broadcast added its own small provocation. The episode aired on Valentine's Day, which meant a story about a teenage romance and a fraudulent medium reached households on the one night of the year most likely to have couples watching television together. Nothing in the writing depends on that, but the scheduling gave the coverage an extra hook and put the episode in front of a larger audience than a typical February week would have delivered. It is also worth remembering how recently the 2008 campaign had ended. 18 months is nothing in political time, and Palin was still very much an active public figure, still speaking, still writing, and still generating coverage weekly. A joke about a former governor of Alaska in 2010 was not a joke about somebody's past. It was a joke about somebody who was on television that same week. The 3 seconds themselves have long since stopped mattering. What survived is the exchange they set off, and the fact that the most persuasive voice in it belonged to the performer the show had hired, rather than to anyone defending or attacking the episode from outside. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Palin never came anywhere near the show. 2 other conservative figures went the opposite way entirely. One of them recorded an entire episode as himself and moved a main character into his home. The other became president of the United States and got an episode where the show turned the criticism back on its own writing staff. Section 8, the radio host, and the president, Rush Limbaugh and Donald Trump. The show's creator has never hidden where he stands politically, which makes the 2 biggest conservative episodes in the show's history stranger than they look. One of them was made with the target's full cooperation. The other one turned into an argument about the show itself. The Limbaugh episode is called Excellence in Broadcasting, the second episode of the 9th season, written by Patrick Mahan, directed by John Holmquist, and first broadcast on October 3, 2010. The title comes from the phrase Rush Limbaugh used to describe his own radio network for decades, and the working title during production reportedly referenced a book by Al Franken that had attacked him years earlier. Limbaugh voiced himself, and the show handed him a great deal of screen time to do it. He was, at that point, the most listened-to talk radio host in the United States and one of the most influential figures in American conservative politics, with an audience that had followed him since the late 1980s. The plot puts Brian, the household liberal, on a collision course with him. Limbaugh comes to Quahog for a book signing, and Brian goes down there to confront him. The confrontation collapses immediately when Limbaugh asks whether Brian has ever actually read anything he has written, which Brian has not. Brian storms off, gets jumped by a street gang on his walk home that night, and Limbaugh appears out of nowhere and beats the entire gang single-handedly. Grateful and rattled, Brian reads the book and then flips completely. He announces that conservative republicanism has been right all along and starts attacking liberals with the same energy he previously spent attacking the other side. Lois challenges him. Brian defends his right to change his mind. Limbaugh comes over for dinner. It goes badly, and Brian moves out of the Griffin house to live with him as a roommate. From there, the episode turns on Brian rather than on Limbaugh. Brian becomes insufferable, follows Limbaugh to work, tries to force his own opinions onto the radio show, and gets thrown out. He then attempts to waterboard the Speaker of the House and gets arrested for it. Limbaugh bails him out and delivers the actual point of the episode, telling Brian he was never a conservative at all and never really a liberal either, and that the only only thing he has ever wanted is to be the underdog in whatever room he walks into. That reading is not flattering to Brian, and the show knew it. The supporting details show how much room Limbaugh was given elsewhere in the story. He and Brian visit Republican headquarters and are greeted by a former president and a sitting senator. A flashback presents Limbaugh and John McCain as a pair of amateur detectives solving mysteries alongside a talking dog, borrowing the shape of a Saturday morning cartoon. A running gag has Limbaugh hiding a slice of lunch meat somewhere inside his own book to prove Brian never opened it. Nana Visitor voiced the Speaker of the House. Rainn Wilson turned up as his character from The Office, and the lead character from McFarlane's other animated series appears watching the whole thing on television at home. There is also a full musical number called Republican Town, set to a melody borrowed from the stage musical How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, with Limbaugh singing along. The most pointed joke in the episode is aimed at the network airing it. Lois states that anything reported on Fox News becomes a lie the moment it is reported there, and when Chris points out that she is talking about a report she gave herself, she does not budge. Fox broadcast that line without cutting it. Reaction to it was strange. Conservative viewers largely enjoyed seeing Limbaugh presented as competent and physically heroic. The show's own longtime fans were the ones who complained hardest, arguing that an episode built around a friendly portrayal of the most divisive broadcaster in the country was a betrayal of what the series had always been. Reviewers mostly found it slow, and it remains one of the lowest-rated episodes of that period among the show's own audience. The friendship behind it was real and it lasted. McFarlane and Limbaugh stood on opposite ends of nearly every political question and continued to speak warmly about each other in public anyway, which had become a rarer thing by the end of that decade than it was when the episode aired. Limbaugh remained the dominant voice in American talk radio until his death in February 2021. 9 years after that episode, the show handled a different conservative figure in an entirely different way. Trump Guy is the 11th episode of the 17th season and the 320th episode overall. Written again by Patrick Mahan, directed by Joe Vach, and broadcast on January 13, 2019. Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau were both voiced by Josh Robert Thompson, with Mae Whitman as Ivanka Trump and D. Bradley Baker as Mike Pence. Nobody at the center of it cooperated. The president was voiced by an impressionist rather than by himself, and the episode was written to hit as many subjects as possible in 22 minutes. The plot moves the Griffins to Washington after Peter is hired as White House press secretary, and from there the script fires at the Access Hollywood recording, payments connected to a pornographic film actress, the president's relationship with Russia, his business record, and his family, before ending in a lengthy physical fight between Peter and the president. Fox promoted it aggressively and connected it to the previous week's episode, which is unusual for a series that normally treats continuity as optional. The promotional clip released days ahead of the broadcast, in which Ivanka introduces Meg to her father, and he compliments Meg before clarifying that he meant his daughter, generated exactly the coverage the network wanted. The moment people still bring up arrives during the fight. The president accuses the show of building its entire career on the same kind of material he gets attacked for, listing the groups Family Guy has spent 20 years mocking. Peter answers that the show has been actively trying to move away from that. That exchange is the show talking about itself out loud. By the time the episode aired, Family Guy had publicly indicated that it was phasing out a particular category of joke that had run through its early seasons, and that decision had already drawn criticism from viewers who accused the show of losing its nerve. Putting the accusation in the mouth of a sitting president and having Peter concede the point was the closest thing to a public statement the writers had made about it. McFarlane's own history with the subject added another layer. He had served as roast master for the televised roast of Donald Trump in 2011, standing on a stage insulting him for laughs years before any of it became political. In 2017, he publicly criticized Fox News after one of its hosts advised viewers to disregard other news organizations, saying he found it embarrassing to be associated with the same company. Reaction landed where anyone would expect and then kept going. Supporters of the president dismissed it as a lecture wearing a cartoon suit. A large group of longtime viewers complained that politics had crowded out the jokes. Critics who liked it argued it was the sharpest the series had been in years. A short and mostly playful public exchange with the writers of another Fox animated comedy turned into a minor internet event for about a week afterward. Presidents have never been safe in this series regardless of party. The Limbaugh episode alone stacks several former occupants of the office into a single half hour as background material, and across the show's run, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, both Bushes, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama have all turned up as cutaway punchlines built around one exaggerated trait each. The show does not treat the presidency as a subject worth handling carefully. It treats it as a costume rack. That approach creates a specific problem for a series that has now run for more than 2 decades. Political jokes date faster than anything else a comedy writes. A reference that lands perfectly in October of one year can be incomprehensible by the following spring, which is why most of the show's political material lives in quick cutaways rather than full episodes. These two are the exceptions, and both survive mainly because the men at the center of them were famous for reasons that outlasted any particular news cycle. Setting them side by side shows the method more clearly than either does alone. When a political celebrity walks in willing to play, Family Guy will hand them the moral high ground and use the episode to attack one of its own main characters instead. When the target is unavailable, the show will build the whole episode as an attack and then, halfway through, turn the weapon around and aim it at its own back catalog. Neither episode changed a single mind about anything, and neither was ever going to. What they did was demonstrate that a cartoon which had spent 20 years insisting it stood for nothing could still be dragged into standing for something, either by a guest who walked in willingly or by a target who never had to show up at all. The Trump episode also builds a subplot that goes further than the individual jokes around it. Meg tells her family that the president behaved inappropriately toward her, and rather than believing her, they treat the claim as absurd on its face and refuse to take it seriously. The show plays the disbelief for comedy and then lets it sit there because the joke only works if the audience recognizes the pattern from real life. That subplot drew as much comment as anything else in the episode, partly because it was the one section where the writing stopped trying to be funny every 4 seconds. Placing that alongside the Limbaugh episode reveals something about the writer's instincts. Given a cooperative subject, they built a story about a dog who cannot hold a political position. Given an uncooperative one, they built a story about a family refusing to believe a girl. Both episodes reach for the same move, which is finding the ordinary human failing underneath the political noise and putting a griffin in the middle of it. A corporate wrinkle sits behind both of them. For most of the show's run, the series aired on a network sharing a corporate parent with the most prominent conservative news operation in the country, and the writers made a habit of saying so on air. The Fox News joke in the Limbaugh episode is one example. McFarlane's public criticism in 2017 is another, delivered in his own name rather than through a character. Very few writers in television have spent 2 decades biting the exact hand paying them and kept the job. Watching the 2 episodes back to back also shows how much the broader environment changed between 2010 and 2019. Excellence in broadcasting could exist because a liberal creator and a conservative broadcaster could publicly like each other, and because an audience would accept an episode built on that friendship. By 2019, that arrangement had become almost unimaginable, which is why Trump Guy contains no cooperation, no warmth, and no interest in giving the subject a fair reading. The show has kept making political jokes since, mostly in the safer cutaway format, and it has largely avoided building another full episode around a sitting political figure. The 2 attempts it did make sit at opposite ends of a decade, and neither one resembles the other in method, tone, or intent. One detail from the Limbaugh episode deserves a closer look, because it is the sharpest piece of writing in either story. To prove that Brian's convictions are shallow, Limbaugh tells him that a child has been executed in Texas, watches Brian react with horror, and then reveals that he made the story up. The point being made is that Brian's outrage arrives before any of the facts do, and that it would have arrived just as fast if the story had been about something else entirely. That joke works regardless of where a viewer sits politically, which is rare for anything in this category. It is also the moment where the episode stops being an odd favor to a famous friend and becomes an actual piece of comedy, writing about how people hold political opinions. Trump Guy has no equivalent moment, and it does not want one. The episode is built to land as many hits as possible before the credits, and the fight scene at the end is the only place it slows down long enough to think about anything. Given how differently the 2 episodes were made, that difference in construction is probably the most honest thing about either of them. Between them, the 2 episodes cover the entire range of what this show does with a political figure, from handing one the last word to denying another a single sympathetic frame. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some celebrities fight the show, some ignore it, and some send lawyers. In 2009, an entire cast of science fiction icons walked in voluntarily, agreed to be shown as petty and irritating, and let a baby beam them into a bedroom against their will. It was the first time most of them had worked together in 7 years. Section 9. The Starship crew who volunteered. The cast of Star Trek IX actors who had spent years playing some of the most respected characters in science fiction agreed to appear as themselves and be shown as small, petty, and exhausting company. It was the first time the group had worked together on anything in 7 years, and they spent it getting insulted by a baby. The episode is Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, the 11th episode of the 7th season, directed by Greg Colton, written by Danny Smith, and first broadcast on March 29, 2009. The guest list reads like a convention program. Patrick Stewart, Jonathan Frakes, Brent Spiner, LeVar Burton, Gates McFadden, Michael Dorn, Will Wheaton, Denise Crosby, and Marina Sirtis all appeared as themselves. The last time the full group had worked together was the 2002 film Star Trek Nemesis. The standing of that cast makes the joke land harder than it would with almost any other group. Star Trek The Next Generation ran from 1987 to 1994, produced 178 episodes, rescued a franchise that had been dormant on television for 2 decades, and carried on into 4 feature films. For an enormous number of viewers, those 9 faces represent competence, decency, and calm authority under pressure. The episode opens with Quahog hosting its annual Star Trek convention, where the cast sits for a question and answer session. Stewie, who cares about this this more than anything else in his life, does not get a single question in, partly because the audience keeps asking about things that have nothing to do with the show. Furious, he goes home, builds a working transporter in his bedroom, and beams all 9 of them out of their lives and into his house. The convention setting is the sharpest choice in the whole thing, because it targets something every one of those actors had lived through repeatedly. Science fiction conventions built a genuine industry around these performers, with autograph lines, panels, and paid appearances stretching across decades. The relationship inside those rooms is complicated in ways outsiders rarely see. The fans know the material better than the cast does. The cast is answering questions about scripts they filmed 30 years ago. Everyone involved is aware that the work happened a long time ago and that the room is still full. What follows the kidnapping is the joke the episode was built for. Stewie gets exactly what he wanted, which is a full day with his heroes, and discovers that spending time with them is unbearable. They complain constantly. They bicker. They fixate on trivial grievances. They are needy in ways that have nothing to do with the characters they played. By the end of the day, the child who abducted them cannot wait to send them back. Every one of those actors recorded those lines about themselves. Rather than hiring sound-alikes and dodging the risk, the show asked 9 people to come in and voice versions of themselves who were disappointing to meet, and all 9 said yes. Individual members of the cast carried their own history into it. Will Wheaton had spent years as one of the most criticized characters in the franchise, then rebuilt his public life partly by talking about that experience openly and with humor. Denise Crosby had left the series during its first season, and later returned in a different form, and in 1997 she made a documentary about the franchise's fan culture, which means she had already spent serious time examining the exact relationship this episode jokes about. These were not people who needed the concept explained to them. The reason they trusted the show with it comes down to who was writing. Seth MacFarlane appeared twice on Star Trek Enterprise in the early 2000s in a small engineering role, which is not something a network hands to someone who is casually interested. The writing staff included David A. Goodman, who had written for that same series before joining Family Guy. Patrick Stewart had already turned up in a Family Guy cutaway as his Star Trek character years earlier, inside the same 4th season episode that introduced James Woods, and he spent well over a decade voicing an unhinged intelligence chief on MacFarlane's other animated series. The Trek material in this show is not the work of outsiders taking shots. It comes from people who could pass the same trivia test as the audience. That is also why the humor has a specific flavor. The jokes are about small human failings rather than about the series itself. Nobody makes fun of the uniforms, the makeup, or the dialogue. The comedy comes from how often meeting the people behind a beloved piece of work turns into a letdown, and from the fact that the letdown is nobody's fault. The other storyline running alongside it created far more trouble than the celebrity plot ever did. Meg becomes a born-again Christian after a health scare, tries to convert Brian, and eventually outs him as an atheist to the whole town, which turns him into a social outcast. Brian's response to her lands as a straight argument rather than a joke, questioning directly whether a loving creator would have arranged her life the way it is. Religious viewers objected loudly, and reviews at the time reflected that split, which meant an episode featuring one of the biggest guest casts in the show's history ended up being argued about for something else entirely. Then there is the ending, which has nothing to do with either storyline. The show reveals that the entire Family Guy universe exists inside the molecules of a lampshade, and cuts to live-action footage of Adam West and Rob Lowe in a bedroom saying goodnight to each other. 2 real actors, filmed in a real room, closing an animated episode by placing everything the audience just watched on a piece of their furniture. Rob Lowe agreed to appear in that for a joke lasting under a minute that resolves nothing. His participation points at something true about the show's reputation among performers. By 2009, appearing on Family Guy had become a kind of credential. The show would treat a guest badly, and the guest would come out of it looking like someone secure enough not to mind, which is a valuable thing for an actor whose most famous work is decades old and endlessly parodied. The Star Trek cast had spent years dealing with a particular kind of fame, the sort that comes with conventions, autograph lines, and audiences who know the characters better than the actors do. Letting a cartoon show that relationship from the fans' side, and letting themselves be the disappointment, was a joke only they were in a position to tell. The Star Wars parodies the show, produced around the same period, operated on a similar basis. Family Guy made 3 feature-length specials retelling the original trilogy with its own characters, and it did so with the cooperation of the people who own that material rather than in defiance of them. That sits strangely against everything else in this video. The same series that used Carol Burnett's most famous character without permission and had to defend the decision in federal court was simultaneously being handed one of the most protected properties in entertainment because it asked and the answer was yes. The difference comes down to what is being requested. Permission to retell a story is a business arrangement, and the people who owned that material could see what a comedy retelling would do for a franchise that wanted younger viewers. Permission to put someone's signature character on the floor of an adult bookstore is a different request entirely, and no rights holder alive would grant it, which is why the show never asks. So the pattern holds in both directions. When cooperation is available and useful, Family Guy will take it, credit it, and build something elaborate out of it. When cooperation is impossible, the show show proceeds anyway, and lets the lawyers sort out the rest afterward. No lawsuit followed, no statement, no complaint from anyone involved. The episode simply aired, and the people it made fun of had already agreed to every word of it. The transporter itself is a small piece of writing that repays attention. Stewie does not lure the cast to Quahog, hire them, or trick them into visiting. He builds a working version of the technology from their own show and takes them without asking, which means the episode is a story about a fan removing 9 people from their lives by force because he feels owed an afternoon of their time. The show never states that idea out loud, and it never needs to. The complaints the actors make once they arrive are all mundane. They want different food. They are uncomfortable. They talk over each other. Nothing they do is monstrous, and that is exactly why the joke works. The disappointment is not that they turn out to be terrible people, it is that they turn out to be people, which is the one thing a devoted fan is least prepared for. Stewie's reaction completes the point. He does not learn a lesson, apologize, or come away with a healthier attitude toward the things he loves. He simply decides the whole exercise was a mistake and sends them home, and by the next episode his obsession is exactly where it was. The show refuses to let the experience change him, which is a more honest ending than a warmer one would have been. The episode has aged unusually well as a result. Convention culture has only grown since 2009, and the gap between a fan's expectations and the reality of meeting someone has become a far more common conversation than it was then. An episode built on that gap, performed by the exact people on the receiving end of it, sits comfortably alongside anything made since. One more detail separates this from the rest of the show's celebrity work. Nobody in the episode is punished for anything. The cast is not accused of hypocrisy, not caught doing something shameful, and not held up against a public scandal. They are simply shown as ordinary, which in this series counts as unusually gentle treatment. An episode like this also requires an enormous amount of cooperation behind the scenes. 9 working actors, spread across separate projects and separate cities, had to be booked, scheduled, and recorded for a half hour of animation, and the show had to persuade every one of them independently. Any single refusal would have left a hole in the joke, since the premise depends on the group being complete. The fact that the production pulled it off says as much about the show's standing in 2009 as anything in the finished episode. The result carries a strange kind of value for the franchise as well. Long-running casts rarely reassemble outside of reunion panels and anniversary specials, and when they do, the tone is usually reverent. This one reassembled for a comedy that had no interest in reverence at all, and the recording ended up being one of the few times all 9 of them shared a project after the films finished. The episode also sits inside a much longer relationship between this show and science fiction generally. Stewie's obsession with the franchise had been established across earlier seasons, the series had already used its imagery repeatedly in cutaways, and the writers had been dropping references for years that only committed fans would catch. By the time the convention episode arrived, the audience had been trained to expect that the show knew what it was talking about, which is why the cast's participation felt earned rather than opportunistic. That history is also why the episode avoids the trap most celebrity guest spots fall into. A show that does not understand its guest usually ends up writing generic material and letting the famous voice carry it. Here the material is specific enough that swapping in different actors would break every joke, because the humor depends on these 9 people, this particular reunion, and the exact kind of fame they carry. What this episode left behind is the counterweight to everything else in this video. Adam West gave the show 17 years. James Woods gave it 14. Rush Limbaugh gave it an entire episode. Frank Sinatra Jr. gave it a mentor character. The Star Trek cast gave it a reunion. Every one of those people understood that the show would treat them badly, and that being treated badly by Family Guy had become a form of cultural recognition, the sort of attention that says a person is famous enough to be worth the trouble. 9 actors from one of the most beloved series in television history reunited for the first time in 7 years so a cartoon infant could decide they were not worth the afternoon, and every one of them signed off on it. The episode is also one of the few places where the show's affection for something shows through the sarcasm. Family Guy mocks nearly everything it touches, and most of the time the mockery is the whole relationship. Here the writers clearly like the material enough to get the details exactly right before making fun of the people who made it, which is a different posture from anything else in this video. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Volunteering is one thing. In 2005, the writers built a 5-second gag out of a rumor circulating in Hollywood about a famous actor, and nobody outside the industry understood what it meant. 12 years later, that clip went viral worldwide, and the show found itself accused of knowing something it had no business knowing. Section 10. The jokes that stopped being jokes. Kevin Spacey and Harvey Weinstein. A 3-second background gag from 2005 became 12 years later the most discussed thing the show had ever done, and the people who made it spent the following years explaining that they were not prophets and had no special knowledge of anything. The gag comes from an episode called Don't Make Me Over, broadcast during the 4th season in 2005. Brian bets Stewie that he will not take his clothes off and run through a shopping mall. Stewie takes the bet, strips, and runs through the mall shouting for help and claiming he has just escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. The scene lasts a few seconds, and the episode moves on. That episode has nothing else to do with any any of this, which is part of the point. Don't Make Me Over is a story about Meg getting a makeover and the family forming a band. The Spacey line arrives inside an unrelated bet. The same episode also contains a sequence where Peter attacks a late-night comedian over the way he behaves in sketches, and a passing reference to Carol Burnett in the middle of that argument, which means the episode, now famous for one accidental piece of foresight, was also swiping at two other famous people on its way past. In 2005, Kevin Spacey was one of the most respected actors alive. He had won an Academy Award for supporting work in The Usual Suspects, and a second for his lead performance in American Beauty. He had taken over as artistic director of the Old Vic Theatre in London the year before, a position he held until 2015. There was no public accusation of any kind attached to his name, and to an ordinary viewer at home, the joke made no sense at all. Everything changed in late 2017. The actor Anthony Rapp gave an interview describing an incident he said took place in 1986 when he was a teenager, involving Spacey. Rapp's account was published on October 29, 2017, and within weeks, a large number of other people had come forward with allegations of their own. Spacey was removed from the series that had defined his later career, cut out of a finished film weeks before its release, and replaced and effectively disappeared from mainstream Hollywood. The Old Vic ran an investigation and reported that it had received 20 allegations relating to his time there. The 2005 clip surfaced almost immediately and spread everywhere. The framing was consistent across every version of the story. Family Guy had known. Family Guy had told everyone 12 years earlier, and nobody had listened. Seth MacFarlane addressed it directly at the Television Critics Association press tour in January 2018, and his answer was less satisfying than the theory. He said he did not remember who pitched the joke. He said that when it was pitched, the rumor behind it was one he personally had not heard, and that other writers in the room had, and that it had to be explained to him at the time. He also pushed back on the whole idea that the show functions as some sort of predictor of scandals, calling that notion sensationalized. Showrunner Alex Sulkin offered his own recollection, saying he could not remember who came up with it either, but that the timing probably came from a story circulating in 2004 when Spacey reported to police in London that he had been attacked in a park at night and then changed the account afterward. That explanation reframes what the joke actually was. Family Guy did not investigate anything. Writers in a comedy room in Los Angeles had heard talk going around the industry, and they turned that talk into a background gag that only made sense to people who had heard the same talk. It was gossip put on television with a laugh attached, aimed at an audience that mostly would not understand it. The prediction theory also falls apart on volume. Family Guy fires at dozens of famous names every season. Across 25 years, with that many shots, some of them are going to land on something that later turns out to be true. Nobody makes a viral clip out of the hundreds that did not. What the joke does reveal is something less flattering to the industry than to the show. A rumor was circulating widely enough that multiple writers in one room had heard it, and it was established enough to be turned into a 3-second gag with a punchline attached. That means people knew, or at least people talked, and the only place the talk surfaced publicly was inside a cartoon where it could be laughed off as nonsense. Comedy has always worked that way. A joke can carry an accusation that a news article could not print, because a joke does not have to prove anything and cannot easily be sued over. That makes comedy writers unusually early to a certain kind of story, and it also means the format strips the accusation of any weight. Saying something serious in a form designed not to be taken seriously protects everyone in the room, including the person the joke is about. The show returned to Spacey after the allegations surfaced. In a December 2017 episode, following a reference to The Usual Suspects, Peter asks whether the man was gay the whole time, which pointed at the statement Spacey had released in response to Rapp, a statement widely criticized for the way it handled the subject. The legal picture that followed does not match the version of the story that spread online. Spacey denied all of the allegations against him. In 2022, a jury in New York found in his favor in a civil case brought by Rapp. In July 2023, after a 4-week criminal trial at Southwark Crown Court in London, a jury acquitted him of all 9 charges he faced there. He has never been convicted of a criminal offense. Civil claims brought against him in the United Kingdom continued afterward and were later settled out of court, with Spacey denying wrongdoing throughout. Harvey Weinstein is the second half of this story, and there the connection runs through MacFarlane personally, rather than through the show. Presenting the Academy Award nominations in 2013 alongside Emma Stone, he read out the nominees for supporting actress and then congratulated them on no longer having to pretend to be attracted to Harvey Weinstein. The reaction in the room was audibly uncomfortable, and coverage at the time treated it as a tasteless swing at a powerful producer. Nothing came of it for 4 years. When the reporting on Weinstein broke in October 2017, that clip resurfaced the same way the Spacey gag had, and MacFarlane put out a statement explaining where the joke had come from. In 2011, the actress Jessica Barth, who had worked with him on the film Ted, told him about an encounter with Weinstein, in which she said he made unwanted advances and criticized her appearance when she refused. Barth later spoke publicly about it herself. MacFarlane wrote that he made the joke with her account in mind, and that it came from a place of loathing and anger rather than cleverness. Weinstein's own case went through criminal trials, convictions, appeals, and further proceedings across several years and multiple jurisdictions. reactions. Then the show did something that made a lot of people uncomfortable. For the 2018 Emmy campaign, Family Guy sent screener packages to voters with a card on the front announcing that the show had predicted Kevin Spacey and Harvey Weinstein, inviting the recipient to open the case and find out who was next. Inside the case was a mirror. That mailer is the most revealing artifact in this entire section, and the hardest thing here to defend. The show's own creator had spent months telling reporters that the prediction narrative was overblown, and that the Spacey joke came from a rumor he had not even heard. The marketing campaign sold that narrative anyway, complete with a gag implying the recipient might be next, and turned two separate sets of serious allegations into a piece of promotional cleverness aimed at award voters. That decision matters more than the original joke, and for a specific reason. The 2005 gag was careless at worst, a rumor repeated in a room full of people looking for material. The 2018 mailer was deliberate, approved, printed, and shipped, and it took experiences that people had spent years being unable to talk about and turned them into a selling point. The show has never really escaped the reputation it built during those months, and it has not tried especially hard to. Old clips continue to circulate every time a famous name appears in the news, always framed as more evidence that the writers know something. The truthful version, which is that a comedy staff in Los Angeles hears what Los Angeles is saying and turns some of it into jokes, is far less interesting and far more damning about the place those jokes came from. What this whole stretch left behind is the strangest legacy any of these celebrity attacks produced. The show spent 12 years being a punchline, then was briefly treated as a whistleblower, and its creator spent the following years explaining that the truth was less impressive than either version. Across all 10 of these stories, the pattern holds steady. Family Guy takes whatever is available, whether that is a signature character from a beloved variety show, a working actor willing to be crated up like cargo, a dead country singer with 55 #1 records, a politician's family, or a rumor circulating in an industry that protected people for decades. Some of those targets sued, some signed on for years, some never said a word about it at all. The show never once asked which category it was walking into before it started writing. What ties all of it together is the arithmetic underneath. Family Guy fires more shots at famous people per episode than almost any program in television history, and the vast majority of them cost nothing at all, because the target never notices, never responds, or decides that responding would only make it bigger. Every so often, one of those shots hits something that fights back, and those are the ones people remember. A lawsuit, a Facebook post, a viral clip 12 years late, an actor whose name comes off a building. For everyone else, the ones who said yes, the arrangement worked out better than anyone expected. A Batman nobody would hire got 17 years, and a tribute. A 9-person cast reunited for the first time in 7 years. A radio host got a musical number. Being destroyed by this show turned out, more often than not, to be a form of being remembered. The wider context matters for understanding why the clip traveled as fast as it did. Late 2017 was a period when a great many people were re-examining old footage, old interviews, and old jokes, looking for evidence that the information had been available all along. Awards show monologues, talk show exchanges, and sitcom throwaways were all being pulled apart for signs that somebody had known. A cartoon gag with a specific name attached fit that search perfectly, and it required no interpretation at all. Family Guy was not the only show caught up in that. The other long-running animated series on the same network has carried a similar reputation for years, built on a handful of coincidences stretched across hundreds of episodes. Both reputations rest on the same statistical accident, which is that a program producing thousands of jokes about real people over several decades will eventually produce one that looks like foresight. The difference is what each show did with the reputation once it arrived. One of them mostly shrugged. The other printed it on a mailer and sent it to voters. A fair point can be made in the show's defense as well. Comedy writers were not the only people in Hollywood who heard those rumors, and they were among the few who put anything at all into public view. The reporting that eventually broke both stories took years of work by journalists persuading people to speak on the record, and no cartoon shortened that process by a single day. What the jokes do prove is that the information was floating around the industry long before anyone with the power to act on it did anything, which is the part of the story that has never been comfortable for anyone in that business to sit with. One more thing separates this story from everything else in this video. Every other celebrity covered here was mocked for something already in public view: a lawsuit, a film, a verdict, a political position, a career. This one was built on something nobody outside the industry could see, aimed at an audience with no way of understanding it, and it stayed invisible for over a decade before circumstances turned it into the most repeated 3 seconds the show ever produced. That is not a skill anyone can repeat on purpose, and the writers have said as much. 25 years of pointing at famous people without checking first produced one 3-second gag that the internet later decided was prophecy, and the people who wrote it have spent the years since trying to give the credit back. 10 names, 10 different outcomes, and one show that never once paused to work out which kind of person it was aiming at before it started writing. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.